Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. Professor Allen Dershowitz is an American lawyer, a jurist, author, political commentator, prominent scholar on United States constitutional law and criminal law, appointed to the Harvard School Law faculty at age 25, became a full professor at age 28. Been a consultant to several presidential commissions, has advised presidents, United States and United Nations officials, prime minister, governors, senators, and members of Congress, and this morning he's a guest here on the Gary Sutton Show. Professor Dershowitz, an honor to have you aboard, sir.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be on. This is a tough time for the United States. We're going to be battling an enemy that will soon be hiding its fighters among civilians, the way Hamas does. It will be trying to send people with European passports not only to Europe, but to the United States, and to attack us in our homeland. And we're really not well prepared to fight this kind of warfare. And look at the trouble Israel has had. It wins every war on the ground, and it always loses the public relations war. And in my book, Terror Tunnels, I explain why. Because Hamas has developed this brilliant strategy called the dead baby strategy, where it uses children and women as human shields. Their own leaders boast of that. Israel has two choices. It can either let the rockets come or let the tunnels come, or it has to fire back. If it fires back, it will kill some civilians. Hamas stands ready to show the civilians on television. And ISIS is going to follow this tactic. It's a brilliant tactic. It works. The world turns against Israel, blames Israel for the killing of these shields. Think about a common example. If a guy robs a bank and takes a child as a hostage and starts firing from behind the child and killing civilians in the bank, and the police come in and try to stop the bank robber and by accident kill the child, policemen aren't guilty of murder. The hostage taker is guilty of murder. And the same thing is true of Hamas and ISIS when it begins to use hostages or human shields to protect its fighters. And that's what I try to prove in my book, Terror Tunnels.
And I think you make a great point, because the righteousness of any cause then for Israel or any other nation in the world, the United States against ISIS right now, becomes tinged because you are fighting that way. And so terrorism becomes a different kind of adversary than we've ever been used to fighting before. Would that be fair to say?
It's very fair to say. And it also becomes a major recruiting tool. ISIS now uses the beheadings as a recruiting tool, but they will soon shift and use the dead civilians and the dead children as recruiting tools. And it works very effectively. And unfortunately, the media often plays into that, because it's so much easier just to show a grieving parent standing over a dead child than to explain that the reason the child is dead is because Hamas chose to fire its rockets from the most densely populated areas of Gaza, rather than the empty areas of Gaza. There are many empty areas. I'll give you an example of what Israel did just yesterday. The New York Times had a story about a large, high-rise, luxury apartment building in Gaza that was blown up by the Israelis because it was the headquarters for Hamas. Israel warned the people in the building, saying, please get out. Every one of them got out. Not a single person was hurt. And Israel destroyed the building and Hamas's capacity to, command and control from the building. And the United States is going to have to follow in that path. They're going to have to try to figure out ways of getting the fighters without also getting too many civilian casualties. In Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States and NATO forces killed approximately 4 civilians for every combatant, for every terrorist that got. Israel lowered that ratio from approximately 1 civilian to every terrorist. But even that's, high, and you try your best to avoid all civilian casualties, because democracies like Israel or the United States don't benefit at all from killing civilians. They lose. Every time they kill a civilian, they're playing into the hands of their enemies. That's why the enemies want them to kill their own civilians, and Israel and the United States tries its best not to.
You look at Israel carving out a place in the Middle East, and you look at it from the very inception back in the late 1940s, and you look at the different attacks on them. I'm thinking back to, 63, 67, 73, and in every case where they're attacked, they end up, taking land that they would not have had otherwise, and now we ask them to give that back. And I look at that whole situation and kind of compare it to today, and I think, here's Israel fighting every day to just kind of keep the foothold where they are in the Middle East. I think trying to keep a sense of order, a sense of democracy, a sense of safety. And aren't we seeing that on the same level today with civilized nations throughout the world trying to do the very same thing against groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas and other groups that are out there?
And it's going to get worse. Who knows what Turkey will look like in 10 years? It's becoming very extremist in its Islamization. Who knows what Jordan would look like if the Hashemite kingdom were ever to be overthrown? And remember, too, that Israel offered to give back the land that it captured in 1967.
Yes.
It got the three famous no's: no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. In 2001, President Clinton and Ehud Barak offered 95% of the West Bank back. In 2008, Ehud Olmert offered 97% of the West Bank back. The Palestinians said no. They've never accepted an offer of peace because they would prefer to see no Palestinian state than to maintain the nation state of the Jewish people in their midst. And, this is Israel's historic homeland, biblical homeland. Jews have lived in what is now Israel consecutively for 2,000 years, and they have the right to have one state, one nation state of the Jewish people, instead of an additional 44th Muslim state, which would practice Sharia law and wouldn't give rights to women or gays. Israel has gay rights, women's rights, the rights of Christians, the rights of everybody. There's no country in the Middle East that's better to Christians than Israel. So it's amazing to me when people turn against Israel.
We're talking with Professor Allen Dershowitz, who has just written an ebook called Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas, Gatestone Institute with Rosetta Books. And it just came out yesterday. One of the things that you describe in your book, Professor Dershowitz, is Israel's struggle against Hamas is a fight not only to protect its own citizens, but for all democracies. I'm reminded a little bit of some of the writings of a guy like Natan Sharansky, who talks a little bit about the idea that when we fight for one democracy here, we fight for all democracies. Is that the case here where, if Israel goes down, a lot of other democracies are going to go down right after it?
Well, not only that, but the United States would suffer enormously. The United States has no reliable allies in the Middle East except Israel.
That's right.
Nobody knows what Turkey or Jordan is going to look like, but Israel will always be America's strongest ally. It helps it with intelligence gathering in its fight against ISIS. It jointly developed the Iron Dome, which I hope the United States will never have to use, but you never know. It might have to use it to prevent incoming rockets and incoming attacks. Certainly Europe will have to use it. So the United States is Israel's strongest ally, and Israel is the United States' strongest ally in the Middle East. And it's important for the two countries to work together, because they're both democracies, against the forces that would turn not only the Middle East but the world into a caliphate where Sharia law applies and where people are killed if they're Christians or if they're the wrong kind of Muslims. And remember, the most frequent victims of Islamic terrorism are the Muslims. And you would expect, therefore, that reasonable Muslims would turn against ISIS, and some of them have, of course, but they're still recruiting. They're recruiting in London. They're recruiting in Turkey. They're recruiting in the Sinai. They're recruiting in Egypt. And it's just going to get bigger and bigger unless the United States can degrade and destroy it, which it's setting out to do.
Professor Dershowitz, are we doing a good job in the United States of supporting Israel? Are we trying to kind of have it both ways?
We're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
We're supporting Israel part of the way, but not all of the way. When the United States said that Israel could do more to reduce civilian casualties, that was such blatant hypocrisy in light of the fact the United States hasn't done anywhere near as good a job in reducing civilian casualties in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other wars that it's fought. It ought to be supporting Israel's efforts to minimize casualties. And everybody has to remember that every time a civilian dies in Gaza, Israel suffers. It suffers because its own people don't like it. It suffers from the international condemnation. It will do everything in its power to reduce civilian casualties. In the 1967 war, the famous Six-Day War, there were virtually no civilian casualties on the Egyptian and Syrian side, because Israel only attacked the airports, the military airports, the military bases, and everybody that was killed was a soldier. But when you start embedding your soldiers within civilian populations and building your tunnels in mosques and hospitals, what do you expect? I was in one of those tunnels. I wrote this book, Terror Tunnels, because of my visit to that tunnel, and I saw it was located right near a kindergarten with 57 children in it. And no country could allow that. I knew the day I went into the tunnel that there would have to be troops on the ground in Gaza to destroy those tunnels.
When you look at those tunnels, and I've watched a lot of the news reports from those and so forth. I mean, I don't know how you can't be struck by the fact that here's a group tunneling into Israel to do harm to Israelis. I mean, and so when you say about kind of not real good at getting the word out there, or it seems like we ought to be seeing these tunnels all the time and saying, would you want this coming into your country? Would you want this coming into the United States? And what would you do about it if it were coming to the United States? And I would dare say the same thing that Israel has done.
Sure. And also, if Israel didn't have the Iron Dome, there would have been 3,000 Israeli casualties. And if the tunnels hadn't been stopped, there was a report in Ma'ariv, an Israeli newspaper, that said that they were planning a Rosh Hashanah, a Jewish New Year attack, in which they were going to send hundreds of terrorists through 40 tunnels at the same time and attack every kibbutz in every city and town while the Jews were at prayer. And they could have killed 1,000, 2,000 people. So when you talk about proportionality, you don't ask yourself how many Israelis were actually killed, but how many could have been killed had they not taken this action to try to protect their own civilians, just the way the United States would be doing and is doing now in regard to ISIS.
You know, I'm struck. One of the things I know you get at in your book here is why Mideast peace talks should resume. And yet I'm struck over the years as I watch this whole situation take place, and it's going back president after president, especially in second terms, where presidents want to say, I did something there in the Middle East, and we see some kind of accord signed, and then it's broken later. But the point being, it seems like every time we have that, it's for, in late times here, for people to kind of reload, who are the people like Hamas. And it seems like when Israel gives in a little bit, it's taken advantage of each time. Am I reading that incorrectly?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Hamas is going to do this again in 2 years because it wins in the court of public opinion.
Exactly.
Look, I agree with Prime Minister Rabin, who said, you fight terrorism as if there's no peace process, but you engage in peace negotiations as if there's no terrorism. You can't give up on peace. You've got to do everything in your power to try to bring about a two-state solution. But in the meantime, you have to fight terrorism, and you have to fight it toughly. Democracies have to fight terrorism with one hand tied behind its back because we comply with the rule of law. But we have to maintain the upper hand.
And yet at the same time, when you look at one side that says there, all is really no compromise except when they say it in words, and another side that says, well, we're going to try to work with you to get a two-state solution, that being Israel, is there ever a chance that you'll have that? I believe what you're saying. We work toward peace all the time throughout the world, and specifically here, but what do we do differently to maybe make that a different kind of thing where both sides will say, yeah, this would work better if we both kind of came to the table?
No, it's a great question. In Terror Tunnels, I have a description of a cartoon in which Hamas is sitting on one side of the table and the Israeli Prime Minister is sitting on the other side of the table. And Hamas says, our goal is to kill all the Jews. And the mediator says to the Israeli, can't you at least go halfway?
Yeah.
You can't go halfway and allow them to kill as many people as they can. You can't compromise with terrorism, just like we didn't compromise with Nazism. We didn't compromise with Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Sometimes there is no political solution. Chamberlain thought there'd be a military solution to Nazism. He was wrong. There was a military solution. I think the president is right when he says there's only a military solution to ISIS at the moment, and I think the same thing is true with Hamas at the moment. At least you have to defeat them militarily first before they're willing to sit down and negotiate. Look, the Germans became great allies, as did the Japanese, but only after being defeated.
One of the things, though, and talking about the military options right now that are on the table, both in Israel and also regarding ISIS with the United States, is the idea that we seem to always want to make it so nuanced. Maybe that's the nature because of the fact that, civilians are involved and we talk about where they stand in terms of how they're used by terrorist groups. Yet at the same time, shouldn't we be able to state clearly what we want to do here? It seems so many times we kind of fall over our words in trying to do that.
Yes, and that's why I was personally pleased with Obama's most recent speech. I think it was last Wednesday night, where he said, we need to degrade and destroy. We need to target for assassination the leaders of ISIS. That's what Israel's been doing for years. It's gone after leaders not only in Gaza, it's gone after them in Qatar, it's gone after them in other parts of the world, because you can't have sanctuary. If your goal is to kill Americans or to kill Israelis, Israel and the United States has a right to get you first. That's called anticipatory self-defense, preemptive self-defense. It's recognized in international law, and it's the right thing to do.
We're going to take a break. We're going to come right back, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the culpability of the media right now in kind of perpetuating the conflict, and also a little bit about what seems to be the rise of anti-Semitism here in the world. Professor Allen Dershowitz with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Professor Allen Dershowitz, our special guest this morning. He is an American lawyer, a jurist, an author, political commentator, and also the author of a brand new ebook that came out yesterday, Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas, Gatestone Institute, along with Rosetta Books, and he's back with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. The media has some culpability here, and I know you talk about that specifically in your book, Professor Dershowitz, as far as where Israel stands in fighting back against Hamas.
Yeah, because it shows the dead babies and the dead children and the dead women without any context. It's as if they showed, the dead baby in the bank robbery case I gave previously when somebody was holding the baby as a hostage,
right,
not showing that the bank robber was holding him as a hostage. It's so much easier for the media just to show the dead baby than to provide context. For example, rarely showed rockets being fired from schools and hospitals. Only French television and Indian television showed rocket launchings from UN headquarters, from schools, and from hospitals. But the general media didn't show that. It didn't show that mosques are used to build the tunnels. And once you see that, you understand why there have been civilian casualties. It also didn't show the Iron Dome. If not for the Iron Dome, thousands of Israelis would have been killed. And the Iron Dome was a joint operation between the United States and Israel. And remember, Israel never asked for a single U.S. soldier on the ground. All they asked for is some financial and technological assistance, which they return in kind by giving the United States the benefits of its technological innovations. Many of America's most important technologies, military, originated in Israel, which is called the startup nation. It has so many high-tech firms. So, Hamas wins the war of public opinion every time it fights, and Israel wins the war on the ground. So Hamas continues to do it because they don't care about their civilians. They only care about whether or not Israel is going to be condemned in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, at the United Nations, on American universities and campuses. And American universities and campuses are becoming a hotbed of anti-Israeli and also, in many instances, anti-Semitic hate speech and also physical violence. And universities are now beginning to look hard at some of the organizations like Justice for Palestine, which has become a front in many ways for terrorist groups and have used intimidating tactics to try to prevent speakers, including me. They tried to shut me down when I spoke at the University of California once. Of course, I wouldn't let them. I just shouted over them. But some Israeli speakers, including two prime ministers, have been stopped from speaking at American and Canadian colleges because people on the hard left don't want to hear the Israeli perspective. And that's why I wrote Terror Tunnels. I want to make sure that college students have available to them a resource. As I say in the book, my only weapon is the truth. All I can do is give you the facts. You have to decide for yourself.
How do we stay away from gullibility? And not only as students, but as citizens at large, when we see this kind of stuff, and again, we buy into a time when we are deluged with all kinds of information, and we can still remain ignorant even in that blizzard of information many times.
No, I agree with you. And sometimes it's gullibility, sometimes it's just ordinary bigotry. For example, the head of the Senate, I think of the University of Wisconsin, poured blood over our head, calling for a boycott against Israel, saying this was the blood of Palestinian children. I mean, has she ever read a newspaper?
Yeah.
Does she even know where Gaza is? Does she know that all these deaths are attributable to Hamas's dead baby strategy, a carefully calculated plan? And if you don't believe me on it, in my book, Terror Tunnels, I quote one of the leaders of Hamas saying that's why we use children and women as human shields. He explains it in great detail. Then I quote an Egyptian journalist who's an expert on Hamas saying that this is the tactic they use, and it's been very, very successful. And it's successful because bigots like that young woman at the university who poured blood over her head want to demonize and delegitimate the only nation state of the Jewish people.
And again, when people look at you, you're a guy who has stood up over the years as one of the nation's biggest civil liberties lawyers, one of your most distinguished defenders of individual rights, as Newsweek said about you one time. So you're a guy that does think about individual rights and the rights of life and liberty and property and all those kinds of things that people have around the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I support Israel. I don't support Israel despite the fact that I believe in human rights and civil liberties. I support them because I do believe in human rights and civil liberties, and I think Israel is leading the world in trying to fight terrorism within the rule of law. Look, there's no country in the Middle East that's more supportive of Christians, more supportive of women, more supportive of gay rights, more supportive of the environment. If you're a person of the left, how can you be supporting Hamas, which murders gays, which demonizes and delegitimates women, which kills Christians? I just don't get it. You must hate the Jewish state more than you like the Hamas Sharia state. I just don't get why people of the left are so supportive of Hamas, including Jimmy Carter, who ought to know better. But Jimmy Carter, is one of the people who is at fault here because he told Yasser Arafat not to accept the peace offer that was made by President Clinton and Ehud Barak back in 2001.
Yep.
If Jimmy Carter hadn't advised Arafat to do that, there might be a two-state solution right now.
Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. Gatestone Institute with Rosetta Books. It's out now as of yesterday. Professor Dershowitz, certainly appreciate you being with us this morning. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Professor Allen Dershowitz with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Check out the book, Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. It is an e-book, and believe me, a powerful one by a guy who has stood for a long time here in the country for individual rights and also for the rights of Israel to exist. And you heard a lot of the things we talked about this morning. By the way, we'll post that tomorrow on Facebook.com/910WSBA as one of our featured pieces today that we've worked on.